Natural Resources Committee member, Sally Thomas, who is also one of the 50 plus years members of the League of Women Voters of the Charlottesville area. And during that time, she spent several years as a president of the local league. And Sally, of course, as many people know her, was a member of the board of the Albemarle County Board of Supervisors from 1994 to 2010. And during that period of time, plus all her time with the League of Women Voters, she has become extremely knowledgeable about this topic. And so we asked her to please be the person who helps us present this topic today. So I'm turning everything over to Sally from here.
Okay, well, thank you, Muriel. In preparation for today's program, the League Committee asked lots of different people what is not being discussed or understood when dealing with planning and such issues in Albemarle County. The answer that came back from many different folks was history. How did we get here? How did we get to having a growth management plan? There's a long story to tell, and first Liz Palmer is going to discuss what we mean by growth management. Whoops, you're still muted, Liz.
Yeah, okay. And thank you. And I'll just say a few minutes about who I am for people who don't know me. I've been on the league, in the league, I think, for about 20 years. And local veterinarian, put that aside, now retired, but I spent 8 years on the Albemarle County Service Authority Board of Directors, another 8 years on the Albemarle County Board of Supervisors, and 6 years on the Ravenna Water Sewer Authority Board of Directors, and have been involved. The reason why I got into the league in the first place was the water supply plan and the lack of in-stream flow requirements on the Mormons River and South Fork Ravenna Reservoir. And so I've been involved in water issues for a lot of years. I'm currently on the Albemarle County Service Authority Board of Directors after leaving the Albemarle County Board of Supervisors and the Ravenna Water and Sewer Authority at the end of last year. So anyway, please forgive me for sort of reading this, but time as it is, I'm going to just first define what we mean by growth management. And growth management in this context is not controlling or limiting population, but instead it's directing development to areas that meet the county's long-term goals. It's about accommodating new building and activities in the most efficient, environmentally sustainable way to support good quality of life for current and future residents. Major reasons to direct growth to specific areas are to protect natural resources, for instance, drinking water resources, valuable agricultural soils, and to cost effectively provide services such as fire, rescue, police, schools. And if we do more compact development, it's cheaper to provide those. So local government's power to control where different types of development occur is limited by the state. Local government's major power over land use is zoning, and the comprehensive plan is a blueprint for the physical development of the county and is critical in defending the local government's land use decisions. And that's why we put so much emphasis on the comprehensive plan. Although worded differently today, the goals of the Albemarle County Growth Management Plan are much the same as they were in the very first comprehensive plan. There have been changes in emphasis and events that have influenced implementation, some of which we'll discuss later. But our basic growth management goals are: promote the efficient utilization of county resources through a combination of designated development areas and rural areas, County resources refers to money spent on things like transportation, schools, fire rescue, utilities, water and sewer. We are to direct growth into the designated development areas, protect natural, scenic, and historic resources, and discourage rural residential development other than dwellings related to agricultural or forestal use. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sally again for history.
Okay, because your very good description of what growth management means leaves a question. How did we get the particular growth management plan that we have today in Albemarle County? And I will point out that the local league covers more than Albemarle County, but that's what we're focusing on today. It might surprise you to know that the main subject of that history is our drinking water. Using notes left by league members Treva Cromwell and Charlotte Humphreys, I can start that history in 1965, even though it really would go a great deal farther back into history if we wanted to today. But 65 was the year that the State Health Department warned the city that its South Fork Rivanna Reservoir was sick. That's really surprising because the reservoir wasn't completed yet. It was being eutrophied. I remember that was a new word to us that we had to learn. It was choked with nutrients and algae caused by runoff from upstream land activities, farming, construction, lawns, and waste from a food processing plant. The league actually wrote a booklet called Mud in describing what the reservoir could turn into. The State Water Control Board and others and consultants joined in studies and reports with the same conclusion. It was sick. Soon in the 1970s, county politicians were winning elections on promises to conserve the watershed. It was such a hot issue. In the notes, I found over 30 distinct studies and/or efforts to protect the reservoir that decade. There were lawsuits, battles between the city and the county, UVA scientist studies and advisory committees, the formation of the joint city-county Rivanna Water and Sewer Authority, proposing a sewer line from Crozet, even though it wasn't built until 1987, passing sediment control ordinances, and briefly placing moratoriums against development in the reservoir's basin. One study showed that developed land contributed 7 times the phosphate pollution as undeveloped land. In 1979, a consultant concluded that in order to reduce non-point source loads, comprehensive land use controls were necessary throughout the watershed. The 1977 comprehensive plan, which Liz has pointed out the importance of a comprehensive plan, it uniquely put a strong emphasis on the protection of the South Fork Rivanna Reservoir watershed. Based on that emphasis, in 1980, the county downzoned the reservoir watershed. That is, it made it rural rather than suburban, strictly limiting residential development. Only properties with existing uses or approved developments maintained an urban zoning designation in the rural areas. This is a good map of Albemarle County that shows the watershed in the light blue. This did leave some old stale zoning on parcels, and those help explain some developments in rural areas that seem out of place. For example, Ivy and Earlysville. The downzoning was fought all the way to the Virginia Supreme Court, but prevailed since the purpose of the watershed protection was a firmly established basis for the downzoning. A slightly different topic that ran parallel to the resource protection was a projected population growth. This became quite a concern when, although at the time the county had fewer than 40,000 residents, it was told that in the 1960s by a consultant that it would have 185,000 by 1995. Now, they were off a bit. Currently, we have about 114,000. But from that one shock, how can we possibly handle that population? Zoning and planning began. Zoning came first, basically asking landowners what they wanted. And of course, they wanted as much development potential as possible. The first comprehensive plan, 1971, was an attempt to accommodate that population bolus with 20 designated development areas, even while recognizing the South Fork Rivanna Reservoir issue. It also created a defense against the city's possible annexation of the county's tax revenue producing land. The city did attempt to increase its size by 300% in its last annexation attempt in 1980. And it's hard to overstate how afraid the county was of the city annexation attempts. But the idea was the more spread out, the better. That was the county's idea for development at that point. But when serious long-range planning and staff came on board, and when the courts upheld the 1980 downzoning, planning and zoning further defined that distinction between urban and rather suburban and rural. The concept that grew up was smart growth, not just accommodating, but managing that growth as much as Virginia allows its local governments to do, basically making the area within the growth boundaries as attractive and safe as possible. So then we moved to the 80s and 90s, and I'll let Liz talk from there.
Okay. Moving to the 1980s and 90s, we see fewer major shifts. In 1982, the city and the county signed the revenue sharing agreement. The county agreed to give the city money each year in perpetuity, and in return, the city agreed not to annex any more county land. This removed the threat of city annexation, allowing the county to further reduce the number of villages and better align the development areas with the South Fork Rivanna watershed. Also came the realization that residential building was still high in the rural areas. We were not meeting the county goal of directing development to the development areas, so there was an additional important emphasis put on making the development areas more attractive. Public facilities goal was established that said service levels would be higher in the development area than in the rural area. This could be seen in response times to fire, rescue, and police. Conservation easements in the rural area also became an important component of the county's strategy to reduce residential development in the rural areas. And in the 90s, there were amendments to the comp plan that increased the development area with the addition of Rivanna Village, the North Fork Research Park expansion, which is UVA Foundation, the North Point area, the Piney Mountain area for the National Ground Intelligence Center. These new development areas were outside of the South Fork Rivanna watershed, and still more of the old villages were removed from the development areas. With the 1996 comp plan update, the need to promote infill in the development area was identified. This led to a study group, the DISC committee, and from that came the neighborhood model adoption in 2001. The neighborhood model recommendations were aimed at making the development area more livable. There's key elements of the neighborhood model are a change from suburban to urban form, requiring urban curb and gutter, sidewalks, street trees, parks, and open space. Reduce setbacks, that's how close a building can be to a road, and reduce buffers. Make mixed use easier, find ways for affordable housing to be a part of the mix of housing types, ensure hard development area, rural area boundaries to help push density inside the development area, and to recognize that premature expansion of the development area would frustrate the goals of the neighborhood model and our growth management plan. One last recommendation that we can discuss, and that most would say we've not done well with, is the recommendation that infrastructure to support development should be constructed simultaneously with the development to ensure that increased density will not diminish quality of services currently being provided. This is what neighbors contemplating a new development next door often request and are most concerned about. And the first thing that comes to mind with most of these developments are roads and traffic. Since the 1990s, we have had further adjustments to the development areas. most notably the removal of Biscuit Run properties, which were slated for development, but bought by the state for a state park. Ownership was later transferred to the county, and that park will be opening soon. Master plans for specific areas have been developed, which are important blueprints for urban neighborhood development. And Elaine Eccles, who you'll meet in a few minutes, was the senior planner tasked with implementing the neighborhood model, and she is certainly the expert for questions on that. We've really run quickly through the history of all this. We know we have skipped over quite a bit in the interest of time and getting to the panel, but I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Muriel to introduce our two panelists who have not been introduced yet. And my understanding is I'll stay on the panel and Sally will be asking the questions. So over to you, Muriel.
Okay, I'm afraid that we did get a little bit confused about who was doing what, and I am not quite prepared to give a description of the panelists and their long work with county. So
Step in here and suggest indeed that Elaine, why don't you introduce yourself?
Okay, I'm Elaine Eccles, and I am retired from Albemarle County. I worked there for almost 22 years, county on comprehensive planning primarily, the neighborhood model, looking at growth management. I worked on the update of the last comprehensive update of the comprehensive plan. Master's in urban planning from Texas A&M. I'm from Texas, but have lived in Virginia for about 35 years. What else would you like for me to say, Muriel, or Sally, or Liz?
Well, you became known as the Mrs. Neighborhood Model, I think, probably. For better or worse, because it was controversial and not easy for developers to have the same goals as the Albemarle County neighborhood model always did. But why don't we also let Mark Graham introduce himself?
sorry.
Thank you, Sally. My name's Mark Graham. Retired now, but I served as the Director of Community Development for Albemarle County, which had the planning function as well as the zoning, the engineering, and the geographic information system, all included in it. So very involved with all aspects of the development activity that happened. And that was for the period of 2004 to 2019. At various times, I also served as the county engineer. And then I served for 10 plus years as the subdivision agent, which is the party responsible for assuring all the subdivisions in the county were done per the regulations. Obviously, Elaine and I worked very closely together for a long period of time with all the comp plan changes that were going through and subsequent changes to regulations that happened as a result of those comprehensive plan changes that were anticipated. So that's a quick overview of me, and I'll be glad to answer questions later.
Hey, Sally, may I say one thing really quick about our two panelists?
Sure. Wonderful.
I just want to say that that Board of Supervisors are basically zoning bodies in the state of Virginia. And these two people were, while I was on the board and while Sally was on the board for the most part, the two go-to people for the Board of Supervisors to go to and get them to explain why we couldn't necessarily do what our constituents always wanted, or what was the best way, the legal way, the most appropriate way. And so these people, these two folks were just so important to the success of any board member and their decisions that they made. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
And we feel very lucky to have them today. Thank you both.
Yes.
So, okay, first question. What has our growth management policy, which I think Liz described pretty well, and what has it accomplished? Mark, I think maybe you'd like to talk about that a bit first.
Yeah, I'll just start by, I think what it's accomplished more than anything has been to create a form of development which was attractive for the county. One of the things we had, because we were trying to encourage development in the development areas and discourage development in the rural areas, is recognizing that we had a potential for tens of thousands by right developments, houses in the rural areas. So, and that still exists today. There's that opportunity to have that. So what we've done is we've created a form of development, which is the market, the public has found very attractive. And in doing so, the other thing we've done is by discouraging that development in the rural areas, we've taken roughly 95% of the county and minimized the environmental impacts that we have, especially on those natural resources. By having no development there and little change, it has maintained a lot of the environmental features that people considered so important in this county. And as Sally mentioned earlier, we're really set off by the initial problems with water quality that we had in the water reservoir, and a recognition that those problems need to be addressed.
Elaine, why don't you chime in here? What do you think the growth management policy in Albemarle County has accomplished?
Bear with me just a second. I had downloaded the comprehensive plan and I was wanting to go and look at it in terms of our housing types. And this was the 2015 comprehensive plan when it was last adopted. But it's been mended since then. Nevertheless, with Mark, I agree. The change in a style of development has been really important. We've gotten more mixed use. That was not something that Albemarle County had much of till the neighborhood model was put into place. We have a much greater diversity of housing types. We have had more redevelopment than was taking place. But, you know, as the population grew, we were needing to do something for the housing and the needs of the people who were going to be living in the development areas. And that's an interesting thought about population growth, is that we have the natural population growth. We have the attractors to Albemarle County, which would be our major industry, UVA. But everything associated with our major industries, if you will. So we were going to have to accommodate those people in one form or another. There's been more attention to the importance of the natural resources in the rural area, and I'm not going to say less attention in the development area, but a different level of attention in the development area. We had a reversal of the trend for having more new single-family detached units being built in the rural areas and in the development areas. Now, that it's not a great big huge difference now. It was probably more significant when I left than it is now, but we still have more single-family detached units being built in the development area than in the rural area. So those are some of the positive things. Do you want me to go into some of the not yets?
Well, we were going to get to that, but
oh, okay.
Yeah, I think maybe we'll stick on positive for just a bit yet.
Okay, one more thing, and that is with the natural resources in the development areas, we have been looking at how to make our stream buffers more robust. The floodplain management is kind of a little bit of a mixed response. But one of the things I noticed as I was leaving was the emphasis on endangered species in the development areas. For a long time, we weren't as concerned about endangered species in the development areas because we knew that's where we wanted development to take place. Certainly in the rural area, we wanted to be on top of it. But even adding more attention to flora and fauna that are endangered in the development areas. So we haven't totally lost our natural resources. They're just different than they are in the rural area. How we treat them is different than in the rural area.
Yeah, can see that. So it's popular thing for local government officials like Liz and me sometime to blame the state if things can't be done the way we would like, or some other entity. But sometimes, of course, the state and federal government have very positive impacts on what we can do at the local level. So for a moment, talk about what role, if any, of the state and federal governments or other entities had in affecting enactment of our growth management policies. Once again, Mark, you want to start that?
Sure. Thank you, Sally. From my perspective, there's been a couple of PRIG programs that have come as a result of a state or actually a interstate effort. The Chesapeake Bay program is probably the greatest example for me, in that there was this initiative that we had to do more to protect the waters of the Chesapeake Bay, that the Chesapeake Bay was degrading and we had to reverse the trends. So there was some emphasis from the state on things we could do, both as urban development as well as supporting agriculture and forestry activities to try to encourage a reversal there and actually reduce the amount of pollutants that were entering the bay. That was a big thing. Another thing that is kind of fallen a little to the side is there was actually a state requirement with your comprehensive plan to have a section on urban development areas. And this turned out, when we looked at it, was pretty much what Albemarle County had done. We were only 20 years ahead of the curve, but it was a requirement for a while. It's kind of become less of a requirement and more of an opportunity now under state law. But that was, once again, a recognition that the form of development could not only protect natural resources, but also could reduce the demands on public infrastructure, whether that be the roads, which the state obviously has a large interest in, or the water and sewer capacities for those localities. So all these things tied together, and the state was trying to work with local governments and encourage local governments to do more in their growth management policies to make it a better for everybody.
Liz, I think I'd like to bring you in here, because one of the things that occurs to me is the requirement that the state had that there be a water supply plan, which I think of while the Colorado River is running dry, and thinking that the state was actually rather ahead of some of the Western states in requiring localities to pick out the worst drought of record and figure out how they can provide sufficient water in that situation. You want to say anything about that?
Sure, I can say a few words about that. After our worst drought on record, the hydrologic drought that was in the 2000-2003 timeframe, the state decided that they needed to understand where all the different localities were going to get their water. Were they getting it? Were they all planning on putting their straws in the same in the same water source? For instance, the James River was a big issue, and they wanted to really make sure they were coordinating with the different communities, and so nobody was taking out too much or be falling behind. So while that did not, what that did was basically say, put down all of your water infrastructure, tell us what your plans are, and every 10 years you need to update that plan, which we do now. It didn't orchestrate what we had to do specifically with our water supply plan. That was a whole larger, complicated situation outside of that state plan. But it did force everybody to really look at their resources, their natural resources, including their built resources like water treatment plants and whatnot. And we do now update that every 10 years.
Elaine, do you have anything to say about the impact of state and even federal government on the kind of planning that you were involved in?
Yes, the VDOT came along in terms of working with their manual for
Department of
their street
Transportation.
design manual to encourage some of the things that we were doing in the development areas and to give us a little more strength. We were looking for the more urban form, and VDOT really was the Department of Highways, and they were interested mostly in moving traffic, moving people in cars, other motorized movement of people was secondary, but not really pedestrians. But we were ahead of the curve, but it helped us when VDOT changed its regulations, and I think that would probably have been the mid 2000s, like 2004, 2005, to accept some of the things that we wanted to have happen. I think that we were, as Mark said, we were ahead of the curve on a number of these things because Albemarle County's been a planning community for decades. But certainly changes with VDOT regulations affected us and I think improved our ability to achieve our goals.
I remember just as a citizen urging a bike path in a certain area where a road was going to be widened. And I was told by VDOT at the time, oh no, we don't do bike paths. And certainly things have changed on that front. That's good. So I will go on to what Elaine was kind of hinting at before, but are there any indications that suggest that our growth management policies have not accomplished some of the things that they were intended to do? Elaine, do you want to talk about that?
Sure, and it's more in the details than the big picture. The pedestrian orientation was the very first neighborhood model principle, and that was to do things on many levels. One was to decrease the reliance on automobiles. Another thing was to create a more cohesive neighborhoods where people could feel comfortable walking in their neighborhoods. It was also to, in terms of providing alternatives to driving, a nearby mixed use area was going to be a destination for people to walk to, as well as to public parks. And so in terms of the big picture, I think Albemarle County is definitely achieving its goals in terms of making the development areas the most attractive places for people to live in, so that more people will want to live in the development areas than out in the rural area. It still has a little ways to go, or it did when I left. And I just want to say that I've been gone for a number of years. So it could be that Albemarle County has done more than when I was last there. But the things that I noticed were that sometimes we had we were a little ambiguous about where we wanted a pedestrian orientation and where we didn't. On the one hand, we were talking about the need for less reliance on cars, and then we adopted regulations that made it easier to have drive-throughs. So sometimes there's just a little bit of a disconnect. Another one is public parks and open space. We probably have more privately owned open space in the development areas than publicly owned open space. And when I first came in '97, our policy was that public parks were part of the play areas, play field areas with elementary schools. And that's not walkable necessarily. So our neighborhood model said we wanted more centrally located parks and open space, including public parks, but that's expensive. We have to be set up for more public parks. And there are growing pains with changing from rural or suburban parks that are part of school complexes to much smaller parks within neighborhoods. Another thing has to do with rebuilding of slopes. So we have hilly terrain, and the hills have to be modified in the development areas if we're going to have the density that we want. And the rebuilding of slopes needed some more attention, because without good stable slopes and more gently graded slopes, we were getting erosion, a lot of erosion into the streams. And also, if you have steeply graded slopes, you can't create good pedestrian connections from one neighborhood to the next, or even one property to the next. So that is something that I think could have a little bit more attention if it hasn't had already. We've also had a little bit of ambiguity with regards to clear boundaries with the rural area. When I was working with Crozet, there was a desire to have the rural area boundary transition from urban down to rural, rather than having a firm boundary. The comprehensive plan put information or contained information about different ways that boundary could be treated, but we still had a little bit of ambiguity. I have to say that on the whole, I think our growth management policy has accomplished what it set out to do, and it just needs its tweaking. It's growing pains, and nothing is perfect, but I'm proud to have worked in a community that had such important goals for its rural area and development area. So with that, I will turn it back to y'all.
Now, Mark, what did you take on?
Thank you, Sally. I'll start by just briefly mentioning one that I feel somebody will raise if I don't. So affordable housing. And I just would note that is part of our neighborhood model, but it is one of those that has been not only challenging for us, but for every other locality in this country. It's got a lot of inherent issues that make it very complicated. Frankly, probably far beyond my ability to discuss. But seeing how the focus today was really about natural resources, one that I would mention is one of the things we've looked at and worked at in this county is attainment of the state's water control standards for our streams. And what we've seen is we've done a glass half full, glass half empty, depending on your perspective on these things with respect to how the water quality is improved. We have seen some improvement with water qualities in a lot of our streams. Not near as much as we probably had hoped we would accomplish, but what we've learned a lot doing that. And then the other thing is, if we want to look at ourselves relative to other localities and look around the state who are trying to struggle with the same water quality standards, it actually appears our growth management strategy has done a lot for helping us protect a lot of streams and not seeing degradation. Places that have experienced a lot of sprawl have really struggled with that issue, and it hasn't been near the problem for us as it's been for other localities. Still, I think if you talk to the staff and probably the board members as well, they'd probably say that they're hoping we can do better in the future there.
Liz, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I had a couple of thoughts, but do me a favor one, Sally. I had so many thoughts. Repeat the question one more time.
Okay. Basically, what has our growth management policy not accomplished?
Okay, all right. As far as what Elaine was saying, you know, when she was saying that she's been gone for quite a while, and Lord knows we miss her. The Board of Supervisors has definitely put an emphasis on more open space in the development area. However, the money has not really been put there to get it. And it gets back to the old thing of, you know, what do you put money into the police department and salaries and the fire department to give better services in schools? Where exactly do you put the money? But I will say that when I left, and I still believe now, there was a strong emphasis on understanding that we needed better quality of life in the development area with more open space. I will say that the one thing that I mentioned in the intro was that part of the neighborhood model was to to develop infrastructure simultaneously with development. And as I was sitting on the Board of Supervisors for those 8 years, the chronic problem, which goes to natural resources, was what are we going to do about traffic and air quality and those kinds of things when we, for instance, put a large compact development on Rio Road, for instance. It's the place to put it. It's the development area. It has the infrastructure around everywhere but roads. And VDOT does control that. And their policy, to my understanding, was always that you don't put the roads in before the traffic comes. And so we were kind of left with trying to put these developments in the proper place, knowing that there would be impact on quality of life with respect to traffic. And so I just want to mention that. I don't know what the solution is for it, if there is a solution, but it is a conundrum that every board has to wrestle with when they're trying to put more compact development in the development areas. You know, as far as stream health, I completely agree with Mark on this, but the other thing that I find difficult is that we've only really been doing our Bethnic and bacterial monitoring in basically the same way for 20 years. We don't really know what would have happened. We don't know what we had before. We don't know what would have happened had we not downzone the development area. We know that land use has the biggest impact on development. We also know that we have a lot of streams that are impaired from sediment, and a lot of that sediment is legacy sediment from deforestation over the last couple hundred years, and way before we started putting parking lots in and houses in. And so it's a hard question to answer. But I think it's really safe to say that land use has the biggest, you know, impervious surfaces has the biggest impact on land use, and from that, on water quality. And from that standpoint, we've certainly done better than many, as Mark has pointed out rightly. And I guess that's all I would add right now for that.
Okay, I think we'll go on to the next question. One of the things we realized is being talked about a lot in this community right now is resilience and climate change and dealing with that. And we decided that we wouldn't particularly talk about that we were going to talk about our growth management plan and land management. But you really can't get away from thinking in the future of what are we going to do going forward. We've got extreme drought and extreme flood events. So the question is, what aspects of current policy should receive attention in order to advance resilience and protect water resources in the future? Mark, you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, thank you, Sally. It's a really good question, a really hard question, because it's one of these things where we're still speculating somewhat on what the impacts actually will be. We have some ideas about what they will be, but you know, I challenge us whether we've actually can claim to understand all the consequences at this point in time. I think one of the things that, because of that, that's very important for us to consider is the idea that the stream monitoring that we've done, that Liz mentioned, that we've been doing for 20 plus years now, that we keep that up and maybe even expand that, because if there are other consequences that weren't anticipated, that's how we're going to discover them, is by having that data that shows us what's going on out there. So I think that's one thing that's really important. I think the other thing is one of the things is we do anticipate that, as you said, we're going to see more fluctuation in things. We'll have bigger floods, for example. That's one of the things that's anticipated. And that draws a question on whether the way we're doing floodplain management right now is adequate for the future. For example, while we don't allow by right development to occur within a stream, within a floodplain, that's the floodplain as it currently exists today. We haven't really built in an anticipation of increases in that floodplain in the future. And there's a possibility we could do that. For example, houses have a finished floor no less than 4 feet above the current 100-year flood level. That assures that you have some sort of slack or buffer, if you will, to make sure we have that possibility. The other thing is we've put a lot of emphasis in this county on stream buffers, but should we be putting an even larger emphasis on stream buffers? And that's something that I think we're going to find ourselves asking ourselves a lot in the future here.
Right. I certainly was involved in the stream buffer issue many's the time. People think if you don't mow right down to the edge, you're going to have snakes coming into your house, sort of thing. Snakes are a big fearsome thing for having correct stream buffers. Elaine, what would you like to?
Yeah, I think that the stream buffers, those are the two that I would say will be most important for the county. You know, in the rural area, you're not allowed to disturb the stream buffer. In the development area, you can disturb it if you replant it. But there are all sorts of credits that different developers can get when they do development that do not, it doesn't involve really improving the stream buffer once it's been disturbed. And I think that probably, and I am not a watershed management person, I am married to one, but I think that the stream buffers being well vegetated with trees and growth, natural vegetative growth, is really essential to keeping the sediment out of those streams, because the more sediment you get, the more prone to increasing the floodplain there is, in addition to everything else going on. Now, that may be simplified because of the amount of built up soil from erosion, but the more we can keep those stream buffers either undisturbed or replanted, the better off we are. And then the floodplain. We're going to have, as Mark said, we're going to have changes to the floodplain just because of weather-related events. We will have changes to the floodplain because of additional runoff from development. And so being able to predict that should help us know how to better decide where development should go, how it's going to affect where the rivers and the streams want to expand. So I'll just leave it at that. Mark, if you want to correct me on erosion, feel free.
Mark, you okay with that?
Yeah, I'm doing fine. It's obviously a very complex subject, but I think that was a great response there.
Liz, did you have anything you wanted to jump
I
in?
definitely do. I have a few things. Just to add to the complexity of the buffer discussion, we very recently did a stream health initiative, which our previous natural resource manager, who I saw was on this call today, developed and is certainly more expert on this than I am. But that stream health initiative is underway, and one of the top priorities is a buffer overlay district, which is kind of hard to explain in this context, but to put it very quickly, also some of the points are that most of the land in the rural area is rural, and a lot of it is agricultural, and a lot of it are these small farms that, you know, that people, gentleman farms or gentlewoman farms, that aren't really functional farms. They're just called that, and they have the same lack of buffer protection, so that you can mow and clear more easily right down to the stream or the river edge. And really, we protect them, protect our buffers now in the context of a land disturbance. What the Board of Supervisors wanted to do when I left, was to really identify all those buffers and put stronger requirements on them to protect them. And that's a very superficial explanation, but I'll leave it at that for time. The other thing that we did look at in the stream initiative, which I believe is still a priority for the development for the rural areas, is a restoration tax amendment, which would help us when we go from, for instance, an agricultural use over to a development use. We have a lot of situations in the development, and in the rural area, where people will put in an agricultural road and do something agricultural, and in a couple of years they can just make that into a development. So we want to look a little bit closer at restoration of those situations, so that we're making sure we're taking care of streams in that context. And that probably wasn't a very good explanation. But the one thing that I want to say that we have done right, I think, is we have developed a water supply plan that has a lot of redundancy built in, and it is using all of our built built infrastructure in an efficient way. And this water supply plan has not been fully implemented. We've probably got it easily another 10 years in implementation, but it involves connecting our water treatment plants, our reservoirs, and making sure that we can move treated water and raw water around in the most efficient way to supply water for the future. So if we have that severe drought, we will have water put aside in a reservoir to use that. And then if we have high water events, we'll be able to transfer some of that water to replenish that reservoir. So we really can do it, supply the water that people need at the same time as protecting in-stream flow in our rivers, which is really extremely important for maintaining our river systems. And so I hope I made sense right there. Anyway, that's it.
Right. Yeah, I think that's one of the things that as a community we can be proud of. We tried to find sufficient water sources for the people and yet protect the natural resources and the natural stream flow in our creeks and streams upriver, because it's awfully easy just to drain your upriver watershed for the sake of the people. And we really set out to do both, which, as Liz said, we're not quite finished with that plan because it's expensive. But I think the idea that we were going to save both the people and the natural resources is pretty, I think, pretty amazing. We have only one more question, and then we'll get to any questions from the chat box that Michelle will read for us. But in addition to resilience related changes, are there any other updates, especially protecting natural resources, that you would like to see? We've sort of talked about that already, but you know, are there policies that should be changed, but also are there policies that should not be changed? Mark, I'll go to you again.
Thank you, Sally. Yeah, I think this is a great time to recognize that the county has done a lot of really cutting edge things over the last 40, 50 years here. And it's got a great reputation for what it's done, but it's also kept going at it. As Elaine said, it's a planning community. We never stop looking at issues and looking forward. What do we need to be anticipating? I think that's going to be increasingly important because we're going to see more and more fluctuation happening. You know, the highs and lows, the droughts versus extremely wet years. We're going to see a lot of things changing here if the predictions are right about the climate change impacts. And I think it's going to be hard to anticipate all of that. And so that keeping that planning process in place and staying with our current growth management policy in large is probably the best thing we can do. We've already hit on some of the others. The floodplain management, I think that's important for us to look at going forward. Enhancing the stream buffers in any way we can. I think that's important for us to look at in any way we can. Other than that, I think we're doing a pretty good job.
Elaine, what would you like to say?
The things that I think are hugely important are to continue with our policy to not extend public water and sewer outside the development areas. That, in conjunction with zoning, is probably those are the tools that have made us successful. As pressure mounts along the boundaries of the development areas, we've got to be cognizant of the long-term policies so that they stay in place and we don't lose that as the backbone for why we are for our success, so that we don't lose that for the future. So keeping that policy of not extending public water and sewer outside the development areas is important. I think there has to be an acknowledgement that there are people who want to live in the rural area, and that will build houses in the rural area. It's just going to happen. Making sure that folks know what services they can expect and not expect in the rural area is also hugely important to continue with. If we ever get to the point where we feel like we need to expand the development area boundaries, that we ought to be doing it outside of the water supply watershed. Definitely expanding them prematurely is going to frustrate our goals. But if we find over time that the demand for single family detached housing continues to be great, and there has to be some discussion on, do we designate more land for that kind of a use? Just doing it outside of the water supply watershed is what I think will help us in the long term from a natural resources standpoint. I think our grading regulations, if I didn't just say that, are in need of some updating. because the steeper the slope, the more erosion occurs. It's hard to maintain vegetation on really steep slopes, and we have allowed disturbance now in the development areas of some slopes, but 2-to-1 slopes, we've said you can't disturb, but you can. Is it 4-to-1? I'm a little bit rusty on this, but when you rebuild the slope, you can rebuild it more steeply than it was before you disturbed it. So that's something that we need to have some more attention paid to. But keeping going, keeping the political will, and not losing heart when little decisions might not be what one would make for the county as a whole. Keep the big picture in mind.
I would like to say a few things. I see a lot of room for improvement. I see all the good things that we've done. And I recognize that government works ridiculously slowly. So sometimes because we're moving so slow, we miss things, bad things happen. And Elaine really hit one thing on the head, which is political will. Some of the things that I can just tell people that happened to me when I was on the Board of Supervisors, and my other supervisors, of course, there's 6 of us. We had a woman who was hit by a car way down in the southern part of the district and ended up laying on the side of the road for at least 45 minutes before somebody got to her. Neighbors were there trying to keep other cars from rolling over her. You know, she had hurt her back. She knew not to move until somebody got to her. That spurred us on to put a lot more money into, rescue services for that area. But the truth of the matter is that we have slower response times, not that slow, but slower response times for rural area as to development area. And that angers a lot of people. And I got phone calls saying, what do you mean? Just because I live in North Garden, I've got to wait, 15 minutes for the police to get here, where somebody can get the police to them in 5 minutes in the development area. Why am I being subject to that? And so that's a hard thing to answer to people, for an elected official. So you're really sitting there trying to make these decisions in the best way that you can. With respect to water and sewer, I have been a strong supporter of never putting it outside of the development area. But there are a lot of pressures when people come in and say, I have a contaminated well. What am I supposed to do? I'm maybe, not right next to the water supply, and I won't go into our rules and regs right now, but it's difficult when your neighbor calls you up and says, I've got this problem. So the political will is really tough. And I know when I got on the Board of Supervisors for the Samuel Miller District, I had one constituent that was really mad at Sally Thomas for not extending his water line. So anyway, I just, and I'm a firm believer in not doing any expansion on the development area at all until we do infill. I think that's incredibly important, but there are very strong forces there advocating for going a little bit here and a little bit there. And of course, economic development always comes in, and you have people on the board who feel that maybe that's really important. So I would put in a plug for people running for the Board of Supervisors and serving on the Board of Supervisors that really can maintain that political will to keep our planning going forward in a similar fashion with respect to that. And I have a lot of other things I could say, but I'll stop now because we actually have a few good questions coming in the chat, and I know we have to leave time for that. So I'll mute myself.
Okay, we've asked one of our League of Women Voters members to do the reading of the questions coming in through the chat and sharing those. So Michelle, you want to start?
Yes, I think it's only fair, Sally and Muriel, if I just go in the order that the chat questions came in. Obviously, some of the last few questions have to do with what was just last discussed, but so we may have to go back a little bit in time, but I'm going to start with Kim's question. She says, quick question, where are we in the process of updating that 10-year plan?
Comprehensive plan. Let's see.
Sorry, can I chime in and just clarify what I was asking was the water supply plan?
Oh, water supply plan. So I'll take that. We're about to this month look at the capital improvements plan for the RWSA. But last I heard, let's see, we're moving forward with the with locating the new pump station kind of behind over by the Ravenna, excuse me, I should be more organized about this, over by Ragged Mountain Reservoir to take the water from Ragged Mountain Reservoir over to O Hill. We're in the process of upgrading the O Hill treatment plant. We, I believe, have one or two more easements on the pipeline from South Fork to Ravenna, and we're doing studies on the transfer of that water and water quality over there. And right now, the pipeline from South Fork to Ragged Mountain, probably engineering will start around 2027 for that, because we have to have everything else in place, including the larger city water line that goes across the city.
Actually, so the plan that gets sent to the state in terms of
I'm sorry.
the 10-year planning process for water supplying that the state has been requiring. Where are we in that 10-year process?
I apologize. I was thinking our local water supply plan. That 10-year plan, I'd have to look it up. I think we just completed it, but I just really have to look it up, Kim. I can't remember. But I'll get back to you on that. Okay. I think I have your email address. If not, I'll find it. Okay,
Michelle, why don't you come up with the next one?
Okay, this is a comment by Tom Oliver. He says, just a comment from a growth management heretic. Ongoing growth is destroying the things that provide the county with its high quality of life and our natural resource support system. Ongoing growth will undermine urgent climate action goals. Accommodating growth may be meeting some goals, but it isn't the policy we need.
I think we all say thank you to Tom. He is a long-standing advocate of greater population control and always appreciate his words. But I don't know that we need to comment. So why don't you go with the next question?
Okay. This is from Kim Biasioli. Given that the consensus on this panel seems to be that the growth management policy has largely worked to protect natural resources, do you all have any reaction to the new framework for an equitable and resilient community? And if how that policy shift might change the longstanding trajectory of growth in the county and associated impacts to resources?
Anyone?
That's a pretty.
It's Mark. I'll start on that if you want. First thing I would say to Kim is she's exactly right in that, and this is what I was trying to discuss with the last question that Sally asked me, that we're going to have to anticipate with the climate change that there are going to be things that need to be looked at and modified. And I think it's one of the things this community has been pretty good about. This is that ongoing planning and always looking at where we need to make changes and trying to plan for those changes.
Anyone else?
God, I would love to hear, I'd love to hear Kim's answer to that, quite frankly. Yeah, and I would have to agree with Mark. I mean, there's a lot more to do, and I can't sit here and say that we have, our growth management plan has really protected natural resources the way I would like it to. They certainly have not. I think that it's all kind of relative, and I'm proud of us because we've gotten started on this really early. But I think that we need a lot more political will, quite frankly, to go forward and do this and, you know, and deal with the future. So anyway, I don't have anything wonderful to add to that, but I would like to hear from her.
But maybe to try to get all our chat questions asked, we should carry on. Michelle, want to do the next one?
Yes, Tom Oliver again. I'd say a majority of the panel judges existing growth management a success, but it's not a full consensus. The new county framework fails because it does not address external limits on our choices for the community we aspire to. Adapting to climate change and becoming carbon neutral will require adopting goals we'd rather not adopt. We need to acknowledge that in the framework, adjust our goals accordingly.
Yes. Yes. I don't know that Tom is asking for a response by those of us present, but except to say yes.
Yeah.
All right, and then there's one more from Kim. Now I'm a little bit confused. There's two Kims as participants. So I'm not sure which one this is, but anyway. Kim Swanson, she answered. Thank you, Kim. Okay. All right. With regard to Elaine's emphasis on restricting water and sewer services, how will the community continue to defend the growth pay for growth philosophy when both developers and citizens complain incessantly about the costs?
Okay, I'll take this one because I'm now on the Albemarle County Service Authority Board of Directors, and our water and sewer is paid by ratepayers. And I know that some people do complain about the cost. When we look at how we compare to other areas in the state, we're actually right in the middle. And I think the growth pays for growth philosophy. First of all, Kim Swanson knows this because Kim also sat on the Service Authority Board of Directors for several years. And the growth pays for growth philosophy pertains to something that the Service Authority adopted. Gosh, I'm not sure when, but before I even got on the board in 2006, it was already adopted. So sometime around 2000 probably. And what that does is charge hefty connection charges in order for new people to get onto the system. A good portion of what our costs are now are maintenance, quite frankly. And I wish that we could use those dollars that we collect for connections for maintenance, but we can only use it for expansion. There's a whole bunch of things I could go into, which are too detailed right now to go into. But I think it's pretty easy to defend it, quite frankly. I don't have any problem with it. I don't hear people incessantly complaining about cost. And I know that we are pretty much in line with a lot of others on this particular thing. And quite frankly, I think it's really important to charge higher charge good sized connection charges to get on. We are not the highest, though. There are other areas that are expanding their water and sewer services more than we are, that have higher connection charges. So if that helps, that's what that's going towards, that question.
Michelle?
That's it.
Okay.
Regarding the questions, I'm still wondering about the invitation for Kim Biasioli to comment on her question. And Kim, if you are still here, we would appreciate hearing from you.
Yeah, I'm here, and I just sorry if you can hear my dishwasher in the background in my kitchen. I'm asking the question just because I also think that the growth management policy has worked, and I'm, I guess, concerned about the shift of focus away from growth management and broadening out to, you know, many other really important issues, but seemingly away from what its original focus was. And the words, you know, resiliency, we might assume climate resiliency, but that's not always synonymous with, you know, protection of natural resources, water resources, particularly, you know, some of the policies that are being floated in terms of, you know, developing parts of the rural area. So I was just curious. I mean, I'm much newer to the county and these issues than all of you are. So my perspective is likely different than yours. So I was just curious, you know, how you all view the new framework in comparison to the existing growth management policy, and just, you know, how that might change, you know, the trajectory that the county has been on, that it sounded like as you were talking, most of you felt like was largely working to protect our resources.
I have probably a really basic question for Elaine. Excuse me, for Kim. So when you speak about the new framework, we don't have the comprehensive plan completed yet. So specifically, what in the new framework are you concerned about?
So my understanding, and I could be wrong, there's folks on here who might know better than that, but that the growth management policy in the comprehensive plan is now called the Framework for an Equitable and Resilient Community. And it contains very different language than the original growth management policy that's focused on just very different issues and different elements that will likely be addressed in more depth later in the comprehensive plan. So that's what I mean by the framework.
Okay, all right. I guess what I'm doing is kind of waiting to see what exactly that's going to look like. And, you know, and it's a work in progress. I will say that I feel, having just gone off the board in this past year, that there is a shift in emphasis from the Board of Supervisors and the county staff. And I will say that it is my impression, I am not on the board now, but that that there is a lot of concern, of course, with affordable housing and where we put that, and equity, and also economic development. And certainly affordable housing, Elaine used to tell me all about how she would try very hard to get affordable housing in different areas across the county and not concentrated in one area. I think that there's a lot of pressure just to get more wherever we can. And there is the fear, I guess, from some that we'll start doing larger developments in the rural area, if that's what the concern is. I'm hoping that the Board of Supervisors maintains the growth management plan that we've had in the past, and just adding these adding these new things to it. But I think that's something we need to wait and see. So anyway, thank you, Kim, for chiming in. And if you have anything else to say, please do.
Could I add something here about this issue of water and sewer? I was talking about extending water and sewer outside the development areas. But in terms of growth paying for growth, not from the water supply plan, it is cheaper and easier for developers to build or for builders to build houses in the rural area than it is in the development area. That's simple economics. And because the regulations are not so great, you can't do quantity necessarily all at once, but you can still build fairly. You don't have the same level of regulations because you're not dealing with public water and sewer. When I worked there, there was some discussion about the importance of the county potentially investing more in infrastructure and in development that would reduce development costs to attract more people to the development areas versus the rural area. As Liz said, there are a lot of demands on the county in terms of how it spends its money. But that was one thing that was discussed many times. If the county would invest more money in the development areas, then perhaps the cost would not be so great. And then we get into affordable housing. So the affordable housing issue is a nut that many communities cannot crack. When DISC first started, there was something called the Home Buyers Club, and this may be old news, but the Home Buyers Club was a program to get people ready to go into units, especially affordable units. When we could get proffers for affordable housing, it was expected that Home Buyers Club was going to position people to go right into those units. That went away. I don't know if it's been resurrected, but if there still are units that have been proffered that remain proffered for affordability, then getting people into those units is really paramount. So I hope that at least helps explain a few things.
There's a development near where I live, and it's being opposed by a lot of people. But one of the more optimistic little things that's going on is that the people who you might think were being NIMBYs, in fact, want affordable housing because they recognize, if nothing else, that they have a need for workforce housing. And so they're being strongly speaking up for the percent that there ought to be of affordable housing in this large development. So that gives me some optimism. If everybody will speak up for each individual development and having its affordable housing, there's at least some chance that we might see some progress in that area. Michelle, are there any other questions?
Yes, actually, two more comments and questions have come up. Kim Swanson says, may I ask Elaine a follow-up question? So Kim Swanson, if you're there.
Yeah, so I understand that there is less regulation to allow developers to do by right development in a rural area because they have either costs are different for doing a well or for septic. But if you end up having people building something because it's less expensive for not having to do the same kind of water and sewer connections, you could end up with a situation down the line where those people can't afford to maintain those systems. And then where do they go? And we had that happen in our jurisdictional area, where to have affordable housing, developers were just not hooking people up to sewer, even though they should have. And that is not a recipe for creating affordable housing. So I think to say that, you know, those costs are less in the rural area is not, I don't know what it costs to put in a well. I don't know what it costs to drill, put in septic, but it seems to me those are not cheap. But those homeowners then are on the hook for maintaining those systems. So I don't know how that really squares with the affordability trade-off that everybody likes to make about building in the rural area is really cheaper than building in the developed area.
It's a short-term thing, and you're spot on. When the DISC committee discussed this, that's what they said was, for the short term, it might be cheaper in the rural area, but from a long-term standpoint, from a transportation standpoint especially, people need to be closer to the places they work, shop, and play. And so from a building construction standpoint, it's about building a road, it's about setbacks. You don't have to be as careful with setbacks if you've got a lot that's 21 acres versus a lot that's 2/10 of an acre. It's going to be a lot harder to build on the 2/10 of an acre lot than it is on the 21 acre lot. And you don't have to put in roads. So but you're right, it's a short-term versus long-term cost. And so with the neighborhood model, there was a strong emphasis on getting affordable housing in the development areas and not putting it out in the rural area.
And may I add one really quick thing to this? The Board of Supervisors has discussed and I believe put money into this in some situations to supplement to actually use county taxpayer money to pay for the connection charges for certain areas in the development area to help with affordable housing. Another big subject, but that's been a discussion rather than having it come out of the ratepayers' pockets.
One more question, Michelle?
Yes. This is from Kirk Bowers. Affordable housing is a complex issue, as Mark said. What changes in the comp plan update can be made? What are your thoughts?
Okay, that wasn't really totally our subject today, but and Mark, you're the one that said it wasn't for example, but what would you like to you see some changes in the comp plan that will affect the affordable housing issue?
Thanks, Sally. I think the thing I start with always with affordable housing is there are thousands of localities out there trying to find the answer or answers for affordable housing. And nobody's in agreement that anyone's found the answers, whatever they are. I think there's some basic economic issues there. What you can do as a locality is, and Elaine touched on it, is you can have programs that try to prepare people for home ownership and then find ways to have discounted units that those people can move into. I think it really takes both. I don't think it's enough just to have discounted units. We saw that back in the early mid 2000s, where we actually were getting a number of proffered units and we just didn't have people who were in line ready to take those units. So I think it takes both things. You have to have a program that is really going to prepare people for home ownership and make sure they've got the down payment covered, make sure that they understand the ongoing costs that go with the home ownership and they're prepared to take that on. And then the other thing is to get the units that can be available to those people.
Thanks, Mark. And in fact, thanks, Elaine and Mark, Liz and Michelle and everyone. I'm thinking that that we should be wrapping up. Muriel, do we have a?
I think so too. I do have one other question for everyone though, which is sort of off topic, but on topic. I just happened a couple of nights ago to listen to something from Exeter, New Hampshire, where they were bragging about what a marvelous job they had done in planning their community, because part of it had been retaining their core village area and discouraging moving out into the outlying, the rural natural areas. And they were congratulating themselves for having done this as part of long-range planning. And I personally am always citing Arlington as a way to see where long-range planning and sticking to it worked. And that is the other thing they were saying in Exeter, New Hampshire. But I guess my problem is, how while you were working on these things, were you able to come up with any ideas on how you can get some kind of support from the community and from the Board of Supervisors to create a plan and then to like it so much or to support it so much that it will be carried through, or at least, or maybe even to force it to be carried through to completion, which is which is far in the future? Did this concept ever, is it something you've ever thought about?
Mark Graham here. I'll take a start at it, Muriel. I'm probably the worst person to answer it, but I'll go ahead. I would say the answer to your question is first, yes, in that Albemarle has done a lot for trying to encourage community engagement at all sorts of different levels. And I think that's the heart of the question or the issue that you're talking about. I'm an engineer by training. At first I thought, well, these are technical questions. Why do we need to spend so much time engaging the community? Absolutely wrong. Engaging the community is the most important thing to do, because until you have their support for what's trying to be done there, it becomes incredibly difficult for it to succeed.
I might say that one of the reasons things have seemingly stuck to planning concepts in Albemarle County is a rather long list of citizen organizations. The League of Women Voters has been here the whole time, but sometimes there were groups in the early days that I was here that said, well, but there aren't any men, and you have to have men in an organization if you're going to get anywhere. And so there would be different organizations, Citizens for Albemarle, and they had various names over the years. But you don't have to be an elected official to get a group of people together and get people who will come and observe and be present and speak up. But I also have the feeling that this is getting increasingly difficult, partly because in those very same days when they were saying you have to have men or you can't be effective, there were women that weren't carrying on professional lives and had the time to go and sit in Board of Supervisors meetings. League used to have an observer corps. So it's a constant challenge among the nonprofit organizations as to how you keep an active citizenry. It's nice, I with Mark, that it's good that the county seems to be encouraging development, and they're also, I don't mean development, participation. And they're also trying to think of times of day to have people meet and ways to make it easier. But it's a constant challenge in my experience. I don't know if anyone else has a comment.
I can add that the county has spent a lot of money enlarging the communications department. When I first came on, I think there was maybe 1 or 2 people, and now it's definitely expanded. So they're definitely trying. You know, I want to share this really quick because I forgot to earlier on the growth management, just so people can see. And you can read it as we talk, but just to see how we've been directing growth into the development areas. But I do know that we're trying harder to engage the community. You know, we've got a van now that goes out in parks and brings county staff out there, and we have community center now at Yancey, Yancey Elementary, and full-time staff there to do outreach down there. You know, I think that not having I think not having a lot of local coverage in the news, we do have Sean Tubbs doing regular updates on what's going on, which is incredibly helpful. But you know, we do lose a lot in local journalism as papers get bought by other groups and whatnot. But anyway.
If I could just say something about citizen engagement. In my years with Albemarle County, there was never a shortage of citizen engagement in any of the meetings that I attended. So when I would go to conferences and people would say, how do you get citizens to come out? I said, we don't have that problem, because it is a rarity that we don't have, for us to not have citizens come out and express opinions and ask questions and all those things, which I think is very positive for a community. Sometimes it makes for difficult progress, depending on how you characterize progress, but difficult for progress to occur. But people at least are given the opportunity to say what's important, and their opinions really do count. So there you go.
Okay, thank you, and thank you all for really a fascinating discussion. You've just hit on so many topics and are so knowledgeable. We really appreciate it. And I want to remind anybody, if they are interested, to download the chat box if there is anything in there. We don't think we have too much that might be needed, but I'll just remind you about the chat box before you log off. And I hope that all of our attendees have appreciated this as much as I have. And thank you again for coming. And
Thank you.